Today you're gonna learn how to paint smooth, natural looking skin tones, the most common mistakes that ruin them, and 5 simple tips to take your skin painting to the next level. And the first thing I see everyone struggling with is chalkiness. You see, when you're painting skin tones, usually you're using very light colors. And this is true whether you are painting Caucasian skin or a darker one. Eventually you'll use some lighter colors either way. So what is the problem with using light colors? In principle, there is nothing wrong, but usually light colors have some white content in them, and the most common white pigment in hobby paints is titanium white, which has big particles. So if you ever wonder why light paints get chalky so easily, it's these particles sorta clumping together. Now for the solution, you can basically do 3 things to have smoother result. First one is to use less glazing and sketch more. If you glaze everything on your miniature, you are way more likely to experience a chalky finish, because the big pigment particles clump together more, and it's literal snowball effect in action. So personally, I still use glazing, but it's just a tool to refine your miniature further, instead of painting everything. Simple layering and maybe some glazes in between will be much better overall. Another thing is to use the right paint. Have you ever noticed that some paints are more matte and some are more satin? Certain hobby paints are even specifically designed to have that ultra matte finish. And I'm here to tell you that it's actually counterproductive. Yes, having a matte finish can be nice, but by definition, matte paints make the surface more rough, because of the medium that's inside. So if you thin down some of those ultra matte paints like Pro Acryl or Chimera, or even Scale 75, it's no wonder you get chalky finish. You are essentially separating the matte medium from pigment and pushing it around on your model. That means it's better to use paint brands that are not ultra matte, or when you do use them, don't glaze them too much. But all of this won't really matter if you do this. Whenever you see the paint is starting to dry, don't interrupt it, or you'll create texture, no matter what. The second thing I'm gonna say might sound a bit counterintuitive, but bear with me here. So let's say that you are painting something very different from skin. Something like non-metallic metal. To actually create an impression that something is metallic, you gotta paint with high contrast, meaning there has to be a big difference in lights and shadows. And if you do that, then creating something that's perceived as metallic shouldn't be a problem. Doesn't really matter whether it's smooth or rough. In fact, sometimes it can even be to your benefit to make certain reflections very sharp, because it sells the reflective impression even more. So, what does it have to do with skin? Well, for this particular material, it's better to optimize for smoothness over contrast. In fact, unless you're doing something special, I would say that painting skin with relatively low contrast will give you much more credible result. That's because we usually don't perceive skin as being very reflective. To make it actionable for you, here are 2 things you can do. 1. Use many layers when painting skin. Usually I use 6 to 9 layers to paint it, where the first layer is the darkest and the last one is the lightest. And the more layers you put in between the darkest one and the lightest one, the smoother the result you're gonna get. On the other hand, when painting non-metallic metal, I am perfectly fine with using like 5 layers, because I prioritize contrast over smoothness. However, if you really struggle with this and wanna be extra safe, it's not a bad idea to start from a mid-tone and then add some highlights and shading. So does it mean you can't have high contrast? Well, no. You definitely can, but when you do, it's important to know why you do this. For example, when I want to portray something sickly or want to depict a sharp light, I don't shy away from painting strong reflections. It's just that in most cases, it shouldn't be a priority. The next point is very similar to the previous one, because if you do this mistake, your skin tones will look artificial. So let's use some examples and you'll get it. This is Lilith Hasperex from GW, and yes, the skin looks pretty low contrast and smooth, but there is something that feels really off. In another example, this problem is even more prominent. Did you get it? If you didn't, no worries, it's not immediately obvious. You see, when you paint skin, you are not painting bones or muscles underneath. But you should imagine like a sheet that's been put over the muscles. So when you look at these shoulders or even the knees, it looks straight up uncanny, like armor panels. This is also the reason why this elven face looks so harsh. It's just too harshly separated, like wrinkly old face. So when you paint skin, the muscles should be connected, not perfectly divided by a dark line. For example, when I want to portray a young, feminine looking face, I specifically make sure to connect the upper lip with her cheek or the upper cheek with her nose bridge. By the way, do you see this model right here? Yeah, I made part 1 of the tutorial series for her absolutely free on Patreon, so if you're interested, check out the link in the description. But anyway, by connecting everything, it just looks so much more natural, like actual skin, not something artificial. Of course, I don't connect them with all of my layers. But let's say I use 8 layers to paint the entire skin. I'll use 5 to 6 of them to connect everything, and then, with those final layers, I am super selective. So I can highlight the nose, maybe the upper cheek, or whatever I find necessary. However, it's really important that you connect everything initially and start separating it way later. If you feel like you've disconnected something too early, it's also perfectly fine to glaze over that part to bring it all together. And just like that, the skin is connected again. Since we already talked about this mini, I can point out another mistake which I actually made here. You see, for this miniature I wanted to portray a really pale skin tone, almost like this girl barely goes outside. And to some extent I did achieve it, but at the same time it looked too pale and boring, almost lifeless. That impression is even worse given I used rotten yellow, which has this greenish tint. And since I'm painting an actual human here and not a zombie, of course it looks off. But the fix is extremely easy. Simply take some of those more saturated colors and glaze them over midtones and shadows. In this case I am using magenta because I want to make it different from her red jacket, but introducing any warmth and color variety works very well. Honestly, it doesn't matter if you do this with your brush or an airbrush, it's just that the latter option is faster, but obviously adding a face blush with airbrush would be pretty much impossible. However, if you do decide to use airbrush to introduce some color variety, you gotta be adding thin filters. We're talking like 60% water, 30% airbrush thinner, and around 10% paint. Like this, you can apply multiple passes to see the impact without destroying what you already painted. And if you accidentally overspray, just one pass won't be even noticeable. Now, if you've used all of the previous tips, you are like 90% there. But the last 10% is gonna elevate it so much more. When we are painting miniatures, we are not trying to paint something that's realistic. We are trying to show something that's believable or credible. So whenever you're painting, it's a good idea to bend the rules and throw realism out the window whenever you don't need it. For that reason, even if it doesn't make too much sense, I always try to make the face of my mini one of the lightest points, so it really stands out. This is because the face of your model is one of the focal points, along with other interesting features. So whenever you feel like anything on your mini deserves more attention, feel free to make it lighter than the rest, because our eyes are naturally drawn to the lightest parts first. However, it's not always obvious where exactly should you place the reflections on the rest of the miniature. So if you're struggling with that and you want to push your minis from looking like toys to actual work of art, check out this video. It'll help you with that. And see you there.